Greetings, friends. Operational situation at the front on the 4th of February. Let's take a closer look with you today, Kapysko-Limansko direction and AVDEEVKA. And of course, we will start with the Kapyski, matchmaking section of the front. It means that active hostilities are continuing. According to reports from places in the AVDEEVKA area, the enemy, what we talked about yesterday, was pulled up reserves, and is conducting further assault operations both in the north direction between Vladimirovka and AVDEEVKA, and west of AVDEEVKA, as well as south of the settlement itself, along the pike beam, in its western direction. Moreover, we said that there is some activity from the Starch area, which means that additional forces from the Russian troops were transferred to one of the supports, in the direction of the support in the Starch area, and attacks are being carried out between Sandy and Beristev. So, well, conditionally, all this is now fighting for the forest belts, but the enemy does not reduce the pressure on this section of the front, and periodically even strengthens it by attacking with large enough forces. In other words, this area is very, very important for them, as the recent fighting has shown recently. We do not record any new changes, everything remains within the gray zone, because it is possible to contain. It is even possible to counterattack the defense forces in this sector of the front, but still the enemy, his main task, is to take this sector of the front to exhaustion. Plus, the activity of tactical aviation is quite high, which our fighters themselves complain about directly from the field. But here, as they say, frontline air defense is necessary. There is such a thing, but the enemy has very seriously strengthened its aerial reconnaissance in this sector of the front, including Gorodinsk itself. That is, enemy reconnaissance drones are actively working on this territory. Therefore, it is extremely difficult to work on this sector of the front. In the Limansky direction, briefly, without significant changes, but we continue active hostilities. In the direction of Ternov and Yampolovka. Bologorovka, we missed it for several days. The fighting remains positional in nature. They asked me to comment on what is happening there. There is yes indeed, a decline in activity on the part of the Russian troops. That is, they made, as you remember, attempts from the north, from the east, from the southeast, to attack. In some places had partial success. In some places they were rejected, but on the whole the situation today remains without significant changes. That is, the positional nature of the fighting. As in general, we have positional fighting in the Bakhmut direction. We once said a few weeks ago that there were messages. Now we turn to AVDEEVKA, to the important news. So there were reports that in one of the sites, most likely, Russian troops will go on the defensive. That is, there will be classic positional combat operations, but they will no longer conduct large-scale offensive ones. I said then that it was most likely the Kapynsky direction, but I saw it that way. But there is a report that this positionality, which we observe in the Bakhmut direction, is precisely due to the fact that part of the forces from the Bakhmut direction were transferred to the AVDEEVKA direction. Therefore, on the Bakhmutsky, there is still activity there for the most part of the front, but it has a positional character, rather than serious assault actions there by large forces. There is such a moment. And now, we are moving directly to AVDEEVKA, to the northern flank. Today, about half an hour ago, a rather heavy message was published from our military commander Tsoplyenko. Today, according to my sources, the situation in AVDEEVKA has become critical. Russian attack aircraft at a time when it was cloudy, what we talked about a lot, that the enemy is betting and will bet on cloud cover. Strong wind, when the minimum efficiency of aerial reconnaissance. Here, in fact, it is reported that, taking advantage of cloudy weather and the impossibility of high-quality aerial reconnaissance, they entered the city from the northern part of the northern flank. There were fighting where we were sorting out, then why did I sign my daily broadcast yesterday? They broke through the defense. Yes, because well, the enemy really made a major advance by the standards in general, if we take over the last 6 months, where Russian troops were advancing. This is really a major advance in construction, I mean the urban type of battle. And now there are urban battles in AVDEEVKA itself, as reported directly from the field by Venkat. His sources are fighters from the seats. And actually, the situation is not hopeless. We still have time to fix it. This requires combat-ready reserves. Not just reserves, not just those who took the machine gun, but those who have experience, meaning the Bakhmut direction. Those who have experience of fighting in the city itself. The urban type of combat is very, very difficult. We have already talked about this once. This is a fairly complex type of combat, fierce, the hardest. Well, in general, the situation is not hopeless, according to the military. If there are infantry reserves who have experience of fighting in urban areas, the Russian breakthrough can still be eliminated. Well, now let's follow the map. So as you noticed, a gray zone has been added to the depth, and this is AVDEEVKA itself. The part is in the gray zone. The situation, of course, remains to be clarified, because it is dynamic and it cannot be shown now. What is possible is shown. Gray area. In general, from the side of the sand pit, as reported by both Tsoplenko and what we basically saw, the enemy struck from several directions and entered the city itself. Naturally, now Russian troops are pulling up reserves. They have, of course, a prompt response from the AFU, taking all measures to prevent the enemy from leaking further, and accordingly, pull up reserves in this area. But still, there is an important point here, so that you understand the effectiveness of aerial reconnaissance again. It's not for nothing that I complained to you about December, it's not for nothing that I repeated several times a week, that it's also in January, that there may be such a situation that the enemy is betting, as you remember, cloud cover. Strong wind, rain, snow, all this makes it possible for the enemy to do, so to speak, equalize his chances in aerial reconnaissance. That is, it is ineffective on both sides, and then he already uses his advantage in personnel, in artillery, in tactical aviation. Well, then the situation is a little different. Yes, drones have done their job on the battlefield, they continue to do it, but you have to understand that they are. This is not a panacea. And bad weather, especially during this period, it plays a role, and the enemy bets on it. In general, now very heavy fighting is continuing on this sector of the front. There is nothing more to report, so far, except for fierce battles of urban development. There is such a thing. As for the south, the south of AVDEEVKA is holding on very, very tightly, I would say, because recently, yes, we have not seen any changes, which is actually very good, because Russian troops are mostly stopped on this sector of the front, despite the fact that they were stopped. Let's make a remark. Despite the fact that large forces were involved on their part and pulled up wheeled tracked armored vehicles directly to this section of the front. Specifically, they worked with tanks, armored vehicles in the area of the Royal Hunt. It was possible to restrain them further, because they also tried to enter the urban development from the north of the Royal Hunting Complex, yes, which would naturally expand the active area of hostilities, and then the situation in the south would already be very difficult, to put it mildly. It is possible to restrain, counterattack, which in fact, the enemy himself complains about. But the north now, and not only the north, why I said with a remark, it was possible to restrain, because the cloudy weather will now be used by the enemy, used to the maximum. Therefore, the situation remains very, very difficult. And alas, as the military reported from the field, it is critical. This, unfortunately, is true. As far as possible, they take all necessary measures. At the same time, there are, of course, attacks from the enemy from the experienced, that is, Russian troops are also being attacked, in the direction of the Dacha village, near the highway T0505. And naturally, now there is activity on their part, in the AVDEEVKA direction as a whole. We are also saying this for the area with a typical one, that is, the northern flank, where it has been possible to contain any Russian troops in general for the last month without significant changes. But now they have, so to speak, woken up. Therefore, there are heavy battles. We turn to May Day. In May Day itself, we added a little gray area. The enemy has published footage of the advanced positions of the armed forces of Ukraine, and alas, they are approximately in this area, which is in the gray zone. In other words, the situation, what we talked about, where the enemy is advancing at the T-shaped intersection, and the intersection of the highway with the road to the south, actually remains to be clarified, but the main pressure now of the enemy is on Poland-Travneva Street. Therefore, the situation is still dynamic, because the APU is also counterattacking on this sector of the front. Because the enemy has engaged, it cannot be said that large forces are small infantry groups, and naturally there is a possibility that we will even be able to roll back somewhere, so combat work on this sector of the front continues to be active, but still a difficult situation on this sector of the front. Without any specific changes to date, because the dynamic environment remains. Kharkiv direction, and South Donetsk without any changes. According to Krasnogorsk, as we have already allocated a separate direction yesterday, it means that a video was published in the trunk of the Trudovskaya mine, where our AFU fighters are on the second floor. The Russian army fighters are on the first floor, that is, there are close-range shooting battles. It is possible to inflict fire damage to the enemy somewhere, but let's just say that this is an active combat zone now in the trunk at the Trudovskaya mine. Therefore, it would probably be more correct to say that now this whole area is again in the gray zone due to such a dynamic enough situation. Moving on. Let's go straight to the Orekhovsky direction. It means that the enemy, as you remember, made attempts to improve the tactical situation, and one of the goals, as we have already mentioned, is the alignment of the front line. The main goal is along the Uspenskovskaya beam, but before that, the Russian troops set a goal to align along the Surovikin line. To date, we are recording a small advance of the enemy in this area, from the front west of Verbovo, in a section up to 550 meters wide, to a depth of up to 400 meters. This is along just the same Surovikin line, and near it. In other words, it was possible to stop the advance of Russian troops to the west of Verbovo. As you remember, they counterattacked at one of the sites. Then we had partial success, we came to about a T-shaped intersection. It was then possible to recapture, but they were not thrown back to the advanced positions, and the enemy had partial success. So now they are pressing from two directions, well, conditionally align the line of defense along the arc. They are taking tortures, in order to take offensive actions in the future, in the direction of landing, which we have east of work on. As for the work site, are active hostilities continuing? Yes, they continue, both between the new digging work on, and between the digging work on, but we do not record any significant changes in this sector of the front. Although, the activity is again the greatest, in the area of work, and on the part of the recruitment, on the part of the Russian troops. There is one more point, I missed it conditionally Novopokrovka Verbovoye. So, the footage from the AFU was published. The Russian troops at the crossroads tried to advance in a westerly direction. We managed to repel this attack. They also use armored vehicles in this sector of the front, and attempts to advance just the same west of the Verbovo, and conditionally southwest of Pokrovka, are just due to the fact that it is not possible to knock them out between these settlements. And even the APU had partial success in this sector of the front, having drunk Russian troops from part of the forest belt. The entire forest belt actually came under the control of the APU. Therefore, now, the Russian troops are taking these steps to bypass a number of positions that they cannot hold. And moreover, there is partial success on the part of the APU, where it is observed. That's the situation. According to the markets without any changes. There are a lot of statements, but these statements, as you remember, October, November, December, are very loud on the part of the enemy. But they are, let's say, primarily aimed at undermining the morale of the court. That is, in simple words, an information war. As for the artillery, there is one moment, so I will comment from our fighters, that the enemy is actually pulling artillery to the markets specifically. In other words, the Russian troops seriously engaged in this settlement, in order to eliminate the bridgehead, let's say as it is. There are all kinds of messages, including from Russian military officers, Romanov and so on. But in general, together with the messages from our fighters, the first, yes, the enemy is pulling up artillery. But it's not long range, so drones manage to destroy it for the most part. But the number of artillery strikes, of course, from the enemy has increased recently. In other words, the Russian troops are making a very, very big bet on this. And in general, it must be said that based on the reports that have been in the last 24 hours, let's say, it is expected that they will again take active offensive actions in the market to completely take control of the entire settlement. But again, this is not the first time these plans, because there was already such a moment, they carried out active offensive actions. Then the key role, I would say without exaggeration, was played by the Magyar intelligence, which simply did not let anyone near the settlement. Armored vehicles, well, of course, the Marines, they coped then. Now again, the enemy is counting on cutting into the defensive order. Previously, we said, so to speak, to divide our forces in two in a locality. But there are a number of difficulties associated with the activity of the AVDEEVKA in this area. Because, as you have heard, remember, we have also commented on this, perhaps we have read somewhere else. There are a number of sites where the AVDEEVKA sabotage and reconnaissance groups conduct a number of attacks. Operations that also distort Russian troops and do not allow them to concentrate specifically on the markets. Therefore, this is the situation we have in this area. Combat work continues. In general, the situation on the front as we see, without significant changes except for AVDEEVKA. AVDEEVKA, yes, a really critical situation without exaggeration. This is due to the northern flank and bad weather. That's why I complained about it for a reason. It would seem, how is this related? This is due to the fact that, as soon as aerial reconnaissance subsides, the concept of drone efficiency is leveled by weather conditions. Immediately, the enemy activates as much as possible and begins to push and to put pressure on very large forces. Until the evening broadcast, be healthy. Glory to the assembled forces of Ukraine.